Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting this event. We're really excited to be here and to have this opportunity to hold this discussion, and very, I think, privileged to have with us Lolita Chavez. Before introducing everybody on the panel, I just introduce myself briefly. I'm Jen Moore. I'm the Latin America Program Coordinator for Mining Watch Canada. So we're going to hear first this morning from Lolita, Lolita Chavez is a member of the Political Council of the Western People's Council of Guatemala and of the Quiché People's Council of Guatemala. The Western People's Council brings together indigenous organizations from about 5 departments in Guatemala, and the Quiché People's Council located in El Quiché. And she's also been very involved, engaged in community organizing work and support work, and I'll just highlight one piece of that. Most recently involved in integrated process of healing and support for 8 women that were facing orders for their arrest as a result of their resistance to Goldcorp's Marlin mine in northwestern Guatemala. But that's just one of her very lengthy and impressive resume. As well, we're going to hear from Roch Tassé, National Coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, of which that has been participating with Mining Watch and with Peace Brigades International Canada and the Americas Policy Group of the Canadian Centre Council for International Cooperation, looking at the tendencies around criminalization in the Americas, and is going to draw some parallels between what's going on in Guatemala and in the region with some of the recent tendencies we're also starting to observe here at home. And Chris Jones, coordinator for Peace Brigades International Canada, is going to give us a bit of insight into the work, the accompaniment work that they do, and some of the challenges being faced by human rights defenders that they accompany in the context of criminalization, and just to highlight as well that one of the groups that Peace Brigades accompanies is the Quiché People's Council in Guatemala, of which Lolita is part. So I think that's enough for me at the moment. I'm going to pass the mic to Lolita to start things off.
Bien, Sacré Cotton, muy buen día a todas. Estoy muy contenta porque, bueno, en Guatemala cuando se habla de abogacía generalmente son hombres. Y aquí veo a muchas mujeres.
She began with an indigenous greeting and then says, very good day to everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to see this room. In Guatemala, the legal profession is very much filled with men, and I'm happy to see that that's not the case here.
Bien. Bueno, como ya lo decían, y agradezco el espacio, la invitación, la gira también a todas las organizaciones que se unieron en la Red de la Vida por darme la oportunidad. Creo que no nos lo esperábamos porque es muy difícil por los bloqueos territoriales en cuanto a las fronteras. Estamos tan cerca pero tan lejos a la vez, y como hay que pasar por Estados Unidos es una cosa horrible. Entonces, en principio, que tuviéramos la visa era el primer desafío que teníamos.
I'm so grateful for this space and also for all of the energy that the different organizations involved in this tour have put into organizing it through this great network of life. I really wasn't expecting this, first of all, because it's so very difficult for us to cross borders. In a way, we're so close, but we're so far. So it's very difficult to obtain visas, and especially since you have to pass through the U.S. to get here to Canada. So the fact that I'm even here at all is amazing.
ustedes lo entenderán porque conocen las leyes, pero bueno, aparte de ello, pues estoy muy contenta porque estoy conociendo realmente muchas formas de, pues tal vez no tan profundas de lo que está pasando en Canadá, pero algunas expresiones de acá y también poderles contar cómo es que concebimos el mundo tal vez un poquito acá y como lo he dicho en estos días, por ejemplo para el mundo de Occidente hoy es día miércoles, aunque para nosotras como mayas tenemos otro significado. Hoy es la representación del tzikín y es una representación de la abundancia, pero no solo de capital como lo ha visto el mundo de Occidente.
You will understand what I was just saying about visas because you know the Canadian laws. But anyway, I'm grateful to be here. I'm also happy because through this visit I'm coming to understand a bit more about the Canadian context and also getting the opportunity to tell you about how we, Indigenous Maya people, conceptualize the world. We have a very different worldview. Just one of the many examples is that for the Western world, today is Wednesday. But us Maya have a different concept of time and calendar. Today for us is tzikín, which symbolizes abundance, but not just the abundance of capital, but also the abundance of natural resources.
Ya, y no es abundancia solo de capital para acumulación, sino es abundancia de bienestar, de vida, de sabiduría, de también del capital, porque es necesario de diversidad, esa abundancia, pero no solo individual tampoco, sino colectiva y que se pueda compartir.
So it's not, it doesn't mean abundance in the form of capital accumulation, but abundance of well-being, of life, of wisdom. Not abundance in an individual sense, but abundance in a collective sense of all the things that we must share.
Bien, y en este sentido nuestra existencia pues es lo que ha generado nuestra concepción del mundo. Como lo estamos viendo, está generando actualmente mucha expresión de posiciones encontradas, fuertes que no se están entendiendo. Y es pues lo importante que vengo a contarles porque en principio estamos apelando quizá no más por las leyes sino más que por la justicia.
So this worldview of ours is important because the fact that we have such a different starting point, a different worldview than the Western world is in part responsible for the conflictivity and the clashes that we're seeing right now.
Bien. Y en Guatemala pues coexistimos 4 pueblos, el pueblo Xinca, Garífuna, Mestizo y Maya. Y estos pueblos hemos tenido como mucha historia, la invasión, que ayer también comentaba que aquí hubo, la llamada independencia que no fue, y los 36 años de guerra que vivimos, y muchos actores que estuvieron en la época de la guerra con expresiones de genocidio, tierra arrasada en mi pueblo, están actualmente en el poder del gobierno actual.
In Guatemala, there are 4 sort of indigenous peoples, groups, major indigenous groups that coexist, and we have lots of history. Unfortunately, it's a difficult history. First, there was the invasion by the Spanish, then there was the so-called independence, which we don't really consider independence, followed by 36 years of internal conflict in which there were policies of genocide against indigenous people, scorched earth in which entire villages were razed, and many of the current people in government were actually actors during this internal armed conflict.
Y bueno, está existiendo mucha represión, remilitarización, persecución, criminalización principalmente porque los pueblos organizados hemos expresado nuestra decisión colectiva, asamblearia, democrática, participativa y pacífica de que no queremos empresas extractivas que despojan y saquean a la madre tierra con un agregado que es con violencia, a lo cual nosotras y nosotros decimos que es una nueva invasión.
So there is a lot of repression, remilitarization, persecution, criminalization in Guatemala, especially against indigenous people right now. And this is mainly because we have expressed repeatedly a collective democratic participatory decision that we do not want companies operating on our lands and pillaging our natural resources and Mother Earth, especially with the violence that they do it with. We consider this a new form of colonization.
Y esa expresión está expuesta en que más de 1 millón de personas que hemos participado en las consultas comunitarias de buena fe, en donde consultamos si la gente está de acuerdo, sí o no, con las empresas mineras, hemos dicho no, más de 1 millón. O sea, no es una expresión solo de una organización y de gente como que dicen guerrillera o de una gente, sino es de pueblos. Y por ejemplo, en mi caso, yo soy de Quiché, y en Santa Cruz del Quiché, cuando hicimos la consulta en octubre del 2010, más de 27,000 personas participamos en la consulta, entre hombres, mujeres, niños, niñas, porque otro de los aspectos que dentro de nuestra cosmovisión, los niños y niñas tienen derecho desde su concepción.
We have expressed our opinion about mining on our territory through multiple consultations. We conduct community consultations in good faith, and through these, more than 1 million people have rejected mining. So it's not just one organization, as they like to lead us to believe. They like to make it seem like it's a marginal opinion, that it's just extremist guerrilla groups that feel this way. But in fact, it's over 1 million people from all walks of life. For example, in my community in Quiché, in October of 2010, I organized a series of consultations in which 27,000 people expressed their rejection of mining. These people included men, women, children, because in our cosmovision, children have a say right from the beginning of their life.
Y esta expresión de nuestras decisiones en nuestro territorio ha generado toda esa conflictividad generada por las empresas transnacionales, que son hidroeléctricas, las que generan monocultivo, petróleo, y principalmente las empresas mineras, y las empresas mineras que generalmente van de su país, que es Canadá.
This expression of our decision about what we want done with our territories has led to a great deal of conflictivity, because a great deal of mining companies, hydroelectric companies, companies wanting to start up monocultures on our lands want this territory. And unfortunately, a great number of these companies are Canadian.
Bueno, eso hace que el rechazo fuerte del pueblo de Guatemala, ya no solo los pueblos originarios, sino el pueblo en general de Guatemala, expresado en encuestas, expresado en memoriales, expresado en consultas y en otras expresiones, hay un rechazo muy fuerte, no solo a las empresas, sino a la gente de Canadá.
So there's all of this makes for a very strong rejection in Guatemala, not only by indigenous people, but also by the general population, as has been expressed through polls and consultations. A very strong rejection not only of Canadian mining companies, but also of Canada in general.
Y es por eso de la conciencia de que ustedes sepan, ¿y por qué es ese rechazo? Porque están, o sea, ahorita en el gobierno actual, el presidente que decía que es Otto Pérez Molina, genocida, militar que hizo tierra arrasada, está teniendo mucho vínculo con la empresa de Canadá, las empresas canadienses, por ejemplo, Gold Corp, y estas empresas están generando en alianza con el gobierno, porque las empresas no puedo decir que están solas, sino tienen alianzas. Y no son solo las que están atacando, sino es la oligarquía nacional, el gobierno local y el gobierno nacional y las empresas. Y voy a explicar un poquito las expresiones de represión y criminalización al cual estamos.
So in our current government, which is led by President Otto Pérez Molina, it's important to know that he actually was associated, he was a military general during the civil conflict, and was associated directly with policies of genocide and scorched earth. And he now has strong links with Canadian mining companies. So you can imagine that this doesn't sit very well with us. The local government, the national government, the Bolivian or the Guatemalan oligarchy, and these companies are all sort of working together and all contributing to the repression and the criminalization that we're facing.
En principio conceptualizan nuestra existencia diciéndonos que nosotras, las gentes de los pueblos mayas principalmente, somos gente que somos opositores al desarrollo, que somos opositores al turismo, que somos la vergüenza de Guatemala, porque no permitimos que Guatemala camine hacia el desarrollo de las grandes potencias, porque tiene muchas riquezas. Y entonces en esta tipificación de cómo nos conceptualizan, empiezan a atacar principalmente a los liderazgos como autoridades comunitarias, las vocerías, como en mi caso yo soy vocera. Yo no digo lo que solo yo lo que yo pienso, sino lo que pensamos en colectividad, a también autoridades, las líderes y lideresas que hablan públicamente, y todas, pero no solo nosotras, sino la represión ha sido tan fuerte que ya está abarcando a las organizaciones que nos acompañan, porque tienen una estrategia de contrainsurgencia que le llaman quitarle el agua al pez.
They like to portray us Maya people as opponents of development, as opponents of tourism. They tell us that Guatemala is ashamed of us because we're preventing them from being up among the great and wealthy powers of the world. Through this sort of this discourse, they attack indigenous community authorities, leaders, spokespeople like myself, who are not only speaking, talking about what we think, but what our entire community thinks. And it goes further than that. It's not just us. It's also the international organizations that accompany us. We call this strategy taking the water away from the fish. In other words, removing all the supports that enhance our work.
Y bueno, implementan acciones como por ejemplo toques de queda, como no sé si han escuchado o han analizado los estados de sitio. Tal vez sí se ha escuchado un poquito de estados de sitio, que es cuando les quitan todo el derecho de los derechos humanos, que o sea ellos pueden violentar, tienen como autorización de violentar todos nuestros derechos cuando en un pueblo se implementa el estado de sitio. Esa es una de las formas, y ahí ya hay violaciones sexuales, ya han habido violaciones sexuales que no se han podido sacar a luz porque las compañeras no lo quieren decir, porque hay una estigmatización muy fuerte cuando alguien es violada sexualmente. Entonces hay compañeras que han silenciado esto y han habido presos y presas políticas, asesinatos. Les han llegado a invadir en las casas, los soldados llegan con mucha fuerza y mucha violencia, o sea, con la utilización del ejército, con mucha violencia en nuestras casas.
They've been implementing actions such as states of siege. You're probably familiar with the concept. It's where they take away all of the rights of the people in a given community. Through this tactic, there have been rapes, and unfortunately these rapes, there's never any justice for these rapes because so many women feel stigmatized and don't want to report them. There have been political prisoners, assassinations, and home invasions by the army that use extreme violence in our own homes.
Bueno, hay varias acciones. Otra es como los asesinatos que ellos mismos programan, el gobierno con las empresas, y han quedado impunes porque allá en Guatemala también hay un altísimo grado de impunidad que quedan los casos no son llevados a juicios. Un 98% han quedado impunes, solo el 2% son resueltos. Entonces hay presos políticos, hay compañeros que les han acusado injustamente y que les han impuesto fianzas de 50,000 quetzales y años de prisión de 105 años. La causa es únicamente porque defienden el territorio y dicen lo que nosotras decimos, pero están ahorita caracterizándonos como conflictivos, bochincheros, desestabilizadores, y principalmente ahorita ejecutando mucho la acción de que nos están acusando de terroristas.
Other actions include planned killings that are planned in complex ways and collusions between the government and these companies. And unfortunately, there's never any justice for these, or very rarely any justice for these crimes because of the extremely high levels of impunity in Guatemala. There's a 98% level of impunity. Only 2% of cases are ever resolved. People are also put in prison, become political prisoners with symbolic sentences of over 105 years, and there are unjust accusations and huge fines. The unique cause for all of this is that we're defending our territory, but they portray us as conflictive, as troublemakers, as people who are destabilizing the state, and they've even called us terrorists.
Y estas acciones militares han sido muy violentas. Por ejemplo, el año pasado hubo una masacre que el ejército ejecutó a varios compañeros y porque estaban luchando en una protesta. Ellos no eran criminales ni terroristas, sino estaban diciendo, por leyes que se están imponiendo, como las reformas constitucionales en donde se quita el derecho común y se pasa al derecho individual. Entonces estábamos luchando y masacraron a compañeros, y el presidente quiso actuar como en la época de la guerra, diciendo que no eran los del ejército, pero hermanas y hermanos sacaron fotos, y entonces los sacaron y dijo, bueno, sí es el ejército, pero ellos tiraron para arriba, no cargaban armas, dijo primero, y cuando otra vez sacaron otra foto con las armas frente a los pueblos, decían, que con armas decían, disparó para arriba, pero luego sacaron las armas así, bueno, fue en defensa personal. Entonces, cada vez está cambiando, porque antes sí pudo lograr mucha impunidad porque no habían medios de verificación. Ahora no es tan fácil y estamos denunciando.
Military actions have been extremely violent. Last October, for example, there was a massacre by the army of protesters. These people were not criminals. They were just people who were challenging constitutional reforms that would have taken away some of our collective rights. And the presidential discourse was similar to what it was during the wartime period. It started off by saying, it wasn't the army that did it, but then photos came out to show that it was the army. So then the president changed his discourse and said, well, they weren't armed. But then photos came out showing that they were in fact armed. So then he said, they were just shooting up. They weren't shooting at people. But then that too was disproven. And so then finally he said, they were shooting in personal defense. So you can see that with this constantly changing story, there's a refusal to acknowledge the problems, which makes it very difficult for us to obtain our rights.
Bueno, y son muchos casos que quizá ustedes todas aquí no alcanzarían para ser nuestras defensoras porque los casos rebasan, por ejemplo, la cantidad de gente que estamos aquí, son muchos, pero resumiendo, en el caso mío, yo tengo 22 denuncias en mi contra, y las denuncias están en proceso de investigación, no han llegado a ya que sean resueltos a favor o en contra, y uno de los últimos casos que interpusieron la semana pasada es una contrademanda de una demanda que interpusimos nosotras cuando recibí un atentado el 4 de julio del año pasado, que en junio mataron a un compañero que le dijeron que si seguía contra la mina, contra la minería, lo iban a matar. Así fue, lo mataron. Luego recibimos el ataque que me estaban buscando a mí, delincuentes enviados por los funcionarios locales. No me encontraron y hirieron a varias compañeras. Interpusimos la denuncia y quedó ahí, no hubo justicia, no hubo investigación. Y este mes, la semana pasada, recibí una contrademanda en mi contra diciendo que yo había estado en otros lugares, o sea, y la gente está expresando que yo les amenacé de muerte. ¿Puedo seguir?
There's so many cases, I could go on all day about them. There's just not time to tell you about them all. But to summarize, in my specific situation, I currently have 22 official complaints and legal proceedings pending against me. They're pending, they're in process, so there haven't been decisions for or against me yet. But just to give you some background on one of them, in June, one of my colleagues was killed. He was killed and had received warnings that if he continued his anti-mining resistance work, he would be killed, and sure enough, he was. Then in July of last year, there was an attempt on my life. They came looking for me. They were armed, and fortunately, my colleagues refused to reveal my location, and so they didn't find me. So I put in a complaint about this to the justice system, but it's been very slow in moving along, and we've never really heard anything back. But now, all of a sudden, there's an accusation against me, a counter-accusation about that day, saying that I had been brewing trouble that day, that I had threatened people, etc. And this case will likely move along faster.
Y bueno, otra es que yo tengo medidas cautelares de la CIDH, de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, porque ya no hay justicia en Guatemala, entonces interpusimos una demanda ante la CIDH y dio con lugar, y tengo medidas cautelares, hay seguridad permanente, pero como me lo quieren quitar, a todas luces quieren quitarme, porque ellos dicen, no, una india, una pata rajada revoltosa no puede tener seguridad, es inconcebible por el racismo profundo que hay en mi país que yo pueda tener medidas cautelares. Entonces, o sea, aparte de todas las demandas, una de las últimas es que a mí también, o sea, me acusaron de terrorista, que soy un atentado contra la seguridad nacional, que soy un atentado contra la Constitución Política de la República y no merezco tener medidas cautelares.
Another example is that while I currently have protection mechanisms from the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights because of the threats against me, but a lot of people want to take this away from me. They can't conceptualize that I could ever deserve these types of protections. It's very racist. They can't imagine that an indigenous person an indigenous woman especially, would ever merit these kind of protections. So in attempts to take these away from me, they're accusing me of being a terrorist that's going against the constitution of our country.
Y la pregunta que nos hacemos es, ¿por qué tanto daño? O sea, ¿por qué tanta violencia? Y todo, ¿por qué? Todo por el oro y la plata. ¿Y oro para quién? O sea, ¿para qué el oro y para qué la plata? La plata no da vida y el oro tampoco. Y nosotras vamos a seguir diciendo sí a la vida y no a la minería. Gracias.
And we just keep asking ourselves, why so much hurt, why so much pain, why so much violence, and all of this for gold and for silver? What is this gold and silver really for? It doesn't give us life. And for this reason, we will continue to say no to mining and yes to life.
I'll say a few words on ICLMG, International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. It's a coalition of 40 Canadian national organizations from civil society that was set up after 2001, September 11, 2001. In reaction to the anti-terrorism law adopted by the Canadian Parliament in December 2001. All these organizations comprise of the churches, labor, human rights organizations, civil liberties organizations, refugee, immigrant organizations, social justice organizations, international NGOs, all had concerns that the law, not only the law, but measures that governments, Canada and world governments would adopt post 9/11 would have major repercussions on human rights, on civil liberties, on the rights of refugee, migrants, displacement, charitable work. The coalition was set up to monitor all the implications of these so-called anti-terrorism measures, not only in Canada, as I said, but worldwide. So we have relationships with other similar organizations around the world, in Europe especially, and in the United States, because a lot of those measures are led by Western countries, the US, the EU, and Canada. My presentation today will be based on the observations, the monitoring we've done in the last decade around the implications of anti-terrorism legislations, as well as my personal experience in Latin America, specifically in Central America during the era of violence that Lolita's referred to. So all of you know that Latin America has a long history of political repression and gross violations of human rights under various dictatorships and puppet regimes of the United States under the guise of anti-communism during the Cold War. We saw a shift at the end of the 80s with the demise of the Soviet Union, with the end of the conflicts, the peace agreements in Central America, the end of conflicts in other parts of Latin America. And the phenomena that the Western world has called the democratization of Latin America. So that happened around 1990 or so. And this really set the stage for a new invasion, because now we had democratic regimes in those countries, peace, somewhat more quiet than during the violence. Massive influx of international capital, especially extraction industries, mining companies, and in the case of Latin America, mostly Canadian companies. We saw the same phenomenon in Africa, but really bad in Central America and Latin America. The timing of this happened as well with the implementation of neoliberal policies, the World Bank policies. So a convergence of many factors setting the stage for corporate investments and the arrival of mining interests. Canada played a major role at the time. We saw a complete shift in Canadian foreign and aid policy around that time in Latin America. For instance, the priorities of CIDA, Canadian International Development Agencies, shifted dramatically. They were all geared suddenly towards promoting Canadian mining interests. Some NGOs, encouraged by Canadian embassies, Canadian NGOs, even as way back as 1990, were already engaging in partnerships with mining companies. The CIDA program itself, I know personally in the case of Nicaragua, the local program, the local CIDA program shifted to support projects in communities where Canadian companies were operating. We see more of that lately, but that started way back then. There was a new mandate in embassies. Most political attachés were there to promote Canadian financial mining interests. You were walking in an embassy in Central America, and it was like walking in a boardroom of a mining company. Etc., etc. Okay. As predicted, it did not take time that this led to major conflicts over land ownership and protection of the environment, and in some cases, many cases, unfortunately, a resurgence of violence and the adoption by a Latin American government of a discourse which characterized opposition to these mining projects as a threat to national interests, and this opposition to specific economic interests became a threat to national security. And we know that the concept of national security was born in Latin America in the 60s, 70s. So these are really serious words when you accuse people of being against the national security interests of your country in the context of Latin America. So that discourse really evolved, was deployed again around that time and since. That discourse was also accompanied by a resurgence of repression, maybe not to the scale that we had seen during the wars and the conflict. There was definitely repression. We've heard some examples of cases. There were many examples as the one we heard from Lolita. But there was a shift. Instead of raw repression that we had seen, those new democratic states started using criminalization of dissent. Christine will expand on what we mean by the concept of criminalization. Then, that started after 1990, so throughout the 90s. After 9/11, 2001, many countries started to blur the line between criminalization of dissent and terrorism. And they started to use their own anti-terrorist laws against protesters, dissenters. Some of these laws had been imposed on those governments by Western countries after 9/11, as is the case in El Salvador, Ecuador. So these countries, there are cases where these countries use their national anti-terrorist law against protesters. In the case of El Salvador, 2007, I believe, people were arrested in the northern El Salvador for protesting for the privatization of water projects. And they were accused under the new Salvadorian anti-terrorist law. Those charges were eventually rejected by the courts, and these people were finally accused of simple mischief. We saw that throughout the Americas. 300 prosecutions, I believe, roughly around 300 in Ecuador. The so-called progressive government is now prosecuting dissenters against resource companies under their new anti-terrorist laws. Then we have countries like Chile with new left-of-center governments using the old anti-terrorism laws of the Pinochet regime to criminalize dissent, legitimate dissent. Furthermore, civil society organizations, local NGOs accompanying communities were now accused of were portrayed as enemies of the states, working against the national interests and being a threat to national security. Always the same language, national security. And then the next step was to stigmatize international NGOs in support of local NGOs who were supporting the local communities. Peace Brigade International is a good example. Christine will perhaps address that in her presentation. This is in Latin America. I'll try and do a parallel with what's happening in Canada. So this discourse started in Latin America around 1990. We've seen since 2001 a similar evolving discourse, parallel discourse now in Canada, and new measures that attack the right to free expression, the right to association, and the right to legitimate dissent. These measures are characterized by erosion of due process, criminalization of dissent. We just have to think of the G20, G8 demonstrations, 1,000 arrests, unprecedented in Canadian history. Most of these cases were rejected by the court. So again, criminalizing legitimate dissent with no fundamental legitimate reasons. We saw it during the student strike in Quebec last year. The government introduced legislation trying to blur the line between Quebec's national interests and the protesters being against those interests. We saw it against the Occupy movement. We saw it against Idle No More movement not too long ago. That kind of repression is accompanied by militarization of police tactics. It's done by police, but more and more the police forces are using military tactics, military operations. In the case of Occupy movement, we know that the Homeland Security in the United States was leading the police operations throughout the country. So it was really the Pentagon leading the operations, not the police. We've seen in Canada an increasing infiltration and surveillance of legitimate citizens groups and organizations, especially environmental groups, including a news article last week talking about the infiltration and the surveillance of this coalition of citizens group against gaz de schiste au Québec, shale gas. And these are groups not even associated with historical environmental groups, just regular local citizens groups. I'll go back to 2001 now. In 2001, when the government was about to adopt the anti-terrorism law, a lot of civil society organizations, civil rights organizations, civil liberties, human rights organizations, labor, warned Parliament that the definition in the law is so wide that it could encompass legitimate dissent, and there was a danger, the slippery road, that down the road, the government, the authorities might use the anti-terrorism law, Canada's anti-terrorism law, against legitimate dissent. We were warned, we were reassured that this would never happen. The law was geared towards what we commonly understand as real terrorism, would not be used for against legitimate dissent. So what has happened since then? Over the last decade, since the adoption of that law, we've got tons of CSIS and annuals, our CMP and CSIS reports, along with other policy documents of the government that equate economic interests with Canada's national interests, and same reports portraying any group opposed to these interests as a threat to Canada's national security. We kind of heard that in Latin America 10 years before. And since 2002, CSIS and our CMP security reports have consistently devoted a small section of Canada in their reports on Canada's domestic terrorism risk that continued to identify animal rights activists, First Nation activists, environmentalists, and anti-globalization activists as a domestic threat to Canada, without identifying specific groups, but just categorizing those groups as a threat to Canada. In 2009 in Alberta, there were a series of demonstrations against the tar sands led by Greenpeace. There was one occupation of company land where 37 people were arrested for occupying land. At that time, the Alberta government threatened to use the anti-terrorism law against these people. The Solicitor General of the province really put those threats forward, but then after a few weeks he backtracked, and these people were prosecuted under the regular criminal codes. Some charges were dropped, others were people were only found guilty of minor mischief and accused under the criminal code. But still, the threat from the Alberta government to resort to the anti-terrorism law against protesters was quite shocking. Then things really started to escalate about a year ago. Last year, 8 months after Harper got his majority government, the discourse really inflated. And the government launched a series of attacks against specific environmental groups and foundations opposed to various resource development projects. This all came around the opposition to the Northern Gateway pipeline project. They started naming opponents to this project as national security risk, portraying them again as enemies of the state, enemies against Canada's national interests, and starting to vaguely associate them with terrorism as well. Never before had the link between corporate interests and national interests been expressed so clearly in the government's discourse and in the government policy documents. The campaign started in January last year, 2012, and Prime Minister Harper very beginning of January, started talking about his concern about foreign money influencing Canadian energy policy. He was referring to U.S. charitable foundations supporting Canadian environmental groups and efforts to protect globally significant ecosystems in Canada. 3 days later, on January 9, we had the Minister of Natural Resources, Joe Oliver, accusing again environmental groups of using funding from foreign interests groups to undermine Canada's national economic interests. These are his words. Around the same time, there was a debate in the Senate, and a senator appointed by Mr. Harper, his name was Percy Mockler, told the Senate that it had to stop the interference of foreign foundations who were muddling in the business of our country. He then proceeded for the first time to name specific organizations. The list included the David Suzuki Foundation, Packard Foundation, Greenpeace International Foundation, Sierra Club, the Hewlett Foundation, Eco-Justice Canada, Bullet Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Tides Canada, and there were a couple of others. Even Senator Mike Duffy, a person we've heard of lately, stood up in the Senate and said that these foundations were all anti-Canadian. Then this was followed by the budget in March, April last year, introducing new reporting requirements for NGOs to report their foreign sources of funding, reporting their political activities. Between this, that's in around March, April. Just before that, though, in February, the government released its anti-terrorism policy document. It's a document. It's the second one since 2001. It's a document that talks about the threat to Canada, the role of every national security agency in countering those threats, an analysis of the threats. Victase released that, as I said, on February 9th. The document is titled Building Resilience Against Terrorism. However, so it is a document about how to fight terrorism. About 1/3 of this document deals with Canadian threats, not to what we consider terrorism as generally understood, or even as we understood it in the definition of the law. I'll read some quotes from the document because here we see, this is the first document where we really saw a change in the discourse, in policy discourse. In one of the there's a complete chapter dedicated to the domestic threat. In fact, the title of the chapter is Domestic Issue-Based Extremism. And the document goes on to say, although not of the same scope and scale faced by other countries, low-level violence by domestic issue-based groups remains a reality in Canada. Such extremism tends to be based on grievances, real or perceived, revolving around the promotion of various causes such as animal rights, white supremacy, environmentalism, and anti-capitalism. It also says that a smaller number of groups in Canada, and I quote, have moved beyond lawful protest to encourage, threaten, and support acts of violence, quote, and then warns that these groups, I open the quotes, could choose to adopt a more violent terrorist strategy to achieve their desired results. And the executive summary of this report expresses it this way, and I quote, at home, issue-based domestic extremists may move beyond lawful protest to threaten acts of terrorism. The wording of this document really muddles the line here, the distinction between legitimate dissent and terrorism. And it comes with huge stigmatization. I mean, to be stigmatized as a terrorist has huge consequences. Just if you were prosecuted under this act, the consequences, the jail sentences, for instance, are multiplied. You're on terrorist watch list. You're stigmatized around the world. Your reputation is done forever. So it's a really, really serious accusation. That's in this document. Following that, and in the same logic, shortly after, Canada also created an anti-terrorism investigation team in Alberta. After 9/11, they created these teams in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa to deal with threats of terrorism. They're called INSETs, Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams. They're composed of CSIS, the RCMP, Provincial Police, CBSA, local police. These are the units that led the investigation that led to Maya Radar being tortured and other Canadians, for instance, in Ontario. So last year they created a similar unit in Calgary, or Edmonton, anyway, in Alberta, to deal with the emergent risk of terrorism in that province around the tar sands. So again, the mere fact that they created an INSET instead of using regular police work really shows the mind frame in which they operate, that they see these opponents, or at least try to portray them as terrorists. We've also witnessed in the last few years private briefing where corporations are invited by CSIS to get security briefings, and not only does CSIS infiltrate opponent groups and dissenters, they use the result of this surveillance and share it with the corporate sectors now. So our taxes are paying for the security of corporations. I'll stop here.
Maybe. How do you define brief?
You talking on
Okay, yeah, all right. So my name is Christine Jones, and I'm the coordinator of Peace Brigades International Canada section. Peace Brigades International provides physical, protective accompaniment and international presence to threatened human rights defenders. Currently, we're working in Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, Kenya. We have recently closed teams in Indonesia and Nepal, but I think we're going to be probably going back there in about a year. And we are going to be opening a team probably in, what year is this? In 2014 in Honduras. Historically, we've also been present in Haiti, Sri Lanka, North America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and I'm pretty sure I've forgotten one or two countries, and I apologize for that. So PBI accompanies Lolita in Guatemala, and we accompany a number of other community leaders and communities throughout Guatemala that are defending their rights and defending their territories. We also accompany several organizations in Guatemala like UDEFEGUA, which Antonio Catalan, who you heard about earlier, is an investigator for. Throughout our different projects, we accompany a majority of the organizations, aside from individual defenders that we accompany, are engaged in some kind of judicial work or are lawyers' collectives. And I wanted to put that as a context because I think it's really, for us in the broader human rights movement, but for PBI, important to recognize that lawyers that undertake human rights work are often some of the most threatened and targeted human rights defenders going in most of these countries. And I think it's important for the judicial community in Canada and in the United States and in other northern countries to understand the obligations that they have, I believe, with respect to protecting their colleagues in countries where just doing their job as lawyers pretty much means they have a bullseye on them. That's one of the pieces of context that I wanted to provide. Human rights defenders play a pretty crucial role in ensuring that fundamental rights are upheld and that victims are able to seek access to justice. Their work is often challenged because people believe that it undermines the state, and it's actually state agents and non-state agents that feel that it is their responsibility to shut them up. The way that Peace Brigades International works is that by having an international presence on the ground, we don't seek to do the work, we seek to ensure that the political space stays open so that human rights defenders can stay in their communities to do the work that they need to do. But we also play a role of international witness and international presence. And I think something that Lolita has referred to, and that frankly, if you talk to any of the defenders that are sort of front line in these kinds of struggles, or any of the representatives from the judicial community that are seeking to represent those defenders, one of the key issues is actually having access to verifiable information and data so that prosecution can move forward. And one of the roles that PBI has often played is because we are there and on the ground, and often for long periods of time, we are able to provide that kind of information that we ensure makes it out to the international community. So our volunteers on the ground, in essence, are symbolic of a community of concern globally, so that when threats and attacks happen to defenders, including to Lolita, there are ways that we can ensure that there is the ability to provide verified information that is going to be able to be tested and upheld in court. in the context of human rights defenders, not just in Guatemala, but globally, and we've heard from Roch as well, there is an ever-growing continuum of stigmatization and criminalization that is happening. And this is a little bit of a different strategy than what most states have taken on in, you know, probably the last 2 decades. Without being overly crude, it used to be bang, bang, you're dead. And while that's harsh and it's violent and certainly has ramifications for families and communities, it's not quite as subtle as the processes of repression that are happening now, which is the stigmatization, the demonization, and the criminalization that happens. Because when that happens, when a state or non-state actors are seeking to start doing these things, it actually affects not just the communities and the individuals and the families, but it really starts to denigrate the entire legal system, and also the active signatory to different international conventions of what it means for state responsibility and also international responsibility for the upholding of really basic things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like really basic things. And the reason that happens is because it starts to test the definition of different things. So, for example, the general understanding of the term of criminalization and criminology is the process by which behaviors and individuals are transformed into crime and criminals. That's actually the most basic definition you can get, but it is nonetheless the starting point that most criminologists begin when they start their academic career, and it is one that is carried through as you move through your legal studies to potentially become a criminal lawyer. And the reason it's important is it actually links back to some of what Roch was saying, is that as he read in the example of the national security document for Canada, it's the lines of what is criminal and is not criminal are becoming intentionally blurred by states, not just the Canadian state, but absolutely by the Guatemalan state, so that it becomes really much easier for state actors to be able to start to tarnish people's reputation and to start to kind of put those little finagly questions out into the stratosphere, right? Like, is this person really a criminal actor? Are they actually doing what's legal? Is that really their property? Are they really and truly acting in good faith on their community? Or are these just people that are putting themselves up in front because they want all of the glory to be called a community leader? I mean, so it really is a process. I mean, to become in the eyes of the state as a human rights defender who is becoming criminalized doesn't just happen overnight. Right? They don't just wake up and all of a sudden say, Jen Moore, because of your work in anti-mining, you are a criminal. It happens because usually, sometimes for years, they've laid the groundwork in popular media, in mainstream media, in documents like what Roch presented, where the state starts to play around with what common understanding of definition is. And I think that that's a really important piece to this. When the state or non-state actors begin on this continuum of demonization and criminalization, there's several things that happen. First of all, human rights defenders have an increased exposure to physical attack. It becomes something much easier for what we would probably traditionally call criminal elements like gangs and that sort of, which the state often really refers a lot of these attacks to, oh, those were just wild gangs of criminals that attacked those human rights defenders, never mind them. But what happens is it makes it much easier for people to justify attacking human rights defenders if the state themselves are saying that they're criminals. Right? So people will get it into their mind that they're actually doing something good for the state for getting rid of these criminals. It's a really, not to sort of use the cliche term, it is a terribly slippery slope. The point that it also causes psychological distress and family breakdown, this process of criminalization, this process of demonization. Can you imagine what it would be like to be doing what you know is what your community has asked of you, to be doing what you know is well within your rights as a human rights defender, and yet somehow have the full weight of the state brought upon you, identifying you as a terrorist, identifying you as a criminal, and essentially also identifying you as somebody that should be expecting to have the kinds of threats and violence brought down upon you? I am grateful that I don't have to, in any major way, understand what it would be like to live under this. I am also really grateful that I don't have to understand what that would mean to my family and to my children, to know that their mother or their father or their brother are people who are doing the things that they are supposed to be doing as human rights defenders, and yet somehow have put, again, a big bullseye on essentially the entire family and their friends and their community. One of the other major manifestations of the process of criminalization is the undermining of the legitimacy and the credibility of the organization. And again, we've heard Lolita mention this, we've heard Roch talk about it in the context of what's happening with organizations here in Canada, with Greenpeace, with the David Suzuki Foundation. It also opens that doorway to being able to bring other legal processes against individuals and organizations. So the more that the state is able to delegitimize the work of an organization or an individual, really changes the context in which they're able to work within their country, but it also brings in that thread about what it means for international solidarity work, right? So one of the examples that I'm going to give, and actually I'll remind what Lolita mentioned, is it's not that easy for human rights defenders to get visas to come and do things like speaking tours in places like Canada. That absolutely is part of what is happening because of the delegitimization process that a lot of states have been undertaking. Another thing that's happening is that if all human rights defenders that PBI knows and works with seek to actually follow the rule of law, because that's actually another piece of what it means to be a human rights defender, is that you seek to follow the legal organs within a state and at the international and multilateral levels. The state makes that really hard to do in a number of different ways. So for example, let's say you decide that you want to become a registered organization in your country, right? You're doing this legitimately. It also means that you would have the avenues to go to things like the UN and to be able to participate there, or to the Inter-American system. When you become delegitimized as an organization, those routes become cut off to you. The state will also put administrative hurdles in you like you can't imagine. You think it's difficult to get a passport here? Try doing it as a targeted human rights defender in places like Guatemala or Nepal or Indonesia. Lolita's statement about taking the water away from the fish is so incredibly appropriate to all of this that it actually kind of took my breath away when I heard it, because it really is about the starving. The starving in terms of people's access to justice, people's ability to move within their own communities, but most importantly, people's access to universal human rights, I mean, at its most fundamental level. There's also part of this criminalization process is the judicialization of human rights defenders. So when they're starting to smear you, when they are delegitimizing your work, when they are putting on your head essentially 22 different legal statements, it cripples you financially, it cripples you psychologically, and it actually totally cripples you administratively. You end up spending all of your time just trying to fight the state and trying to fight the legal system. You actually don't have the resources or the time, or for that matter, probably the energy to actually continue on doing the work that you know you need to be doing. And that's It's not just the case in Guatemala or Mexico or Indonesia. This is totally the case here. When we've seen how the government has been targeting groups also specifically through the way that they've started to negotiate CETA agreements, is that organizations are spending so much time trying to meet these really frivolous, reporting mechanisms that we actually can't do the work that we need to do because we're spending time writing 40-page documents, which really, if they just went and read the first page of most of our websites, they'd have all the information that they'd need. I know you need me to hurry. I do. Okay. So for that part, I'm going to leave it, but I'm going to just throw out 3 more things that I would really love at some point to actually discuss more broadly, because I think they're really important. The European Union has developed something called the EU Guidelines for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders. And this body of work is mandated to be used in each European mission anywhere in the world, and it's something that the European governments have also committed to funding. And it is what it is. It's the EU Guidelines for Human Rights Defenders, so it calls upon missions to do a whole variety of different things. A lot of the directives and a lot of the information come right out of things like the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights annual reports, especially I would say in the revisions that are happening on these guidelines right now. It's the 2011 Special Rapporteur's report, where there are some key things that are significantly attended to. One are Indigenous rights, one is, pardon my grammar by the way, one is environmental defenders' rights, one is the rights for journalists, and one is also the rights for student activists. And I think that this is a really timely thing for Canada as well. Highly recommend you guys take probably 20 minutes to read it, and I think it's a really important document. The other thing that I'm going to put out there is that one country, and I find it really interesting that it's Mexico, has actually decided to do something legislatively about the protection of human rights defenders in journalism. And in fact, it's called the Mechanism to Protect Human Rights Defenders and Journalists. It's already been passed by the Congress, and what it essentially does is it states, so it's not just if you would like to, but it's actually going to be enshrined into their national legislative and legal systems, a whole series of things that the state is obligated to do for the protection of human rights defenders and the protection of journalists. A significant piece of the work came out as a result of the Special Rapporteur's report in 2011. And one of the things that is enshrined both in this mechanism, which actually hasn't been passed by the new Congress with the new president yet, if people are interested, I'll talk to you about it offside, is also one of the things that is enshrined in the European Guidelines, which is also one of the things enshrined in the Special Rapporteur's 2011 report, is about state officials, so everybody from like the president on down to, you know, the desk officer doing whatever work in whatever department, should not be making any kind of public declarations that seeks to defame or otherwise criminalize human rights defenders. And I think it's really important that so many different bodies within our multilateral systems have really understood that as a core piece that is happening right now. And I think you also can't take that on its own. I think that what Lolita identified about the level of impunity in Guatemala, and actually it's, you know, commentators say it's between 98 and 99.75% rate of impunity. I think it's really important to recognize that while we're getting a lot of these really clear declarations, as we're seeing legal systems within a number of these countries simply not having the capacity nor the will to follow up on a number of these issues, be it direct threat to human rights defenders or flagrant violation to things like, say, in Canada, the official development accountability act, right? I think that this becomes actually a really important place for the judiciary in any country to really start to seek out what role it can continue to play in pressing these kinds of questions and these kinds of responses from government on the variety of issues for things that they have already signed on. I mean, really, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not something we should need to be arguing with our states right now any longer, and I'm needing to be quiet, so thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm just going to provide a couple of concluding comments and then invite your questions. And I think I just want to take us back to why would states want to make criminals of anti-mining activists? And then why are we here having this conversation? Over the last couple of decades, and it's particularly in the last decade and a half that we've seen the globalization of the mining industry. We've seen increasing self-education and organization at the community level in response to the tremendous environmental, social, cultural, economic impacts and costs that the imposition of this industry has on people's lands and territories and lives. And in response to that, we've seen incredible organizing taking place that have gone from being sort of focal points of conflict in local communities to being region-wide and nation-wide processes of organizing that have successfully pushed back on mining laws, mining projects, and expansion projects within the industry. I think it's not out of place to mention that there have been moratoriums on mining concessions in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador over the past 6 years. And only recently have governments started to lift those. So there's been serious limits to how much the industry could advance its interests. This has happened in other parts of the region as well. And I think that this wave of criminalization, remilitarization, stigmatization is taking place in part as a response to heightened resistance and knowledge. And very sophisticated knowledge and resistance strategies that have been multiplying and have been quite effective. And the conditions have also changed. So the political conditions are not such that there can be all-out bloodshed. The political conditions are not such to warrant that, but within those constraints, the state, in hand with the industry, is developing sophisticated mechanisms to take the water away from the fish, to make it really hard for communities and their allies to do their work, and for solidarity activists to do their work within this context. And I think why this is important to be thinking about here is because Canada plays a tremendous role in terms of promoting this industry here at home and abroad. And more than ever, the government is putting all of its resources and all of its state agencies behind the harmonization and toward that end. So why have we come together as a working group, and why are we here having this conversation today, is that this is affecting all of our work. It's affecting most intensely and most acutely activists on the ground like Lolita, who are doing this direct organizing. And it's also affecting all of us in our daily work in terms of the time that everybody has to spend gathering information, responding in urgent situations, and trying to figure out how do you get past the legal obstacles and the attacks and the threats that are coming in order to get on to what your real work is. And more resources are being caught up in that. And so there's a necessity to start to strategize around how do we respond once again to these strategies of containment and violence to try to, again, push back on gains that have been made by social movements and important social movements in these different areas, be that around cracking the corporate veil and trying to hold corporations to account for abuses that are taking place, be that the direct defense of the right of indigenous peoples to decide what sort of development is good for them on their lands and territories. So, and I think in terms of thinking around solutions and strategies, for me, one of the things that's becoming clear through the series of conversations that we've been having as a working group and that we're now trying to kind of open up and have in different spaces is the importance of an integrated defense, the importance of a holistic approach to this that recognizes that these aren't isolated cases, that this is a systemic issue. And so our response to it is not about how do we just address the individual cases and that are arising, but rather how do we come up with a process and approach to this that helps us be stronger as social movements again at the end of the day, and not further individualized and isolated in strategizing around these individual cases. And I think if we have time, I'd be really interested in hearing Lolita talk about some of those strategies, particularly, and I think one of the cases that's very notable for this is the case of the 8 women who were slapped with arrest charges for 4 years because Crisanta Perez cut off the electricity to the mine for a few days when her complaints over the fact that this electricity post had been put on her property without adequate information and without her full consent led to these arrest warrants out for her arrest and for the 7 women that came to her side to support her at that moment when she was threatened, and then lived for the next 4 years under tremendous psychological duress because they were not just being threatened with possible arrest from the police authorities, they were also being discriminated and stigmatized by their neighbors, by their local authorities. They were being challenged, not being cut off from potable water projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Life became hell for 4 years. And the legal defense in its one thing was a complicated thing, but the Sununija women's movement in Guatemala developed a really interesting, I think very important, integrated defense project that 4 years after those charges were laid, those women are now free of those charges, but not just free of those charges. They are refortified in their defense of the land with a new women's organization that has gone through some political regrounding and strengthening so that they can continue in their work and be stronger in it. So I think for me, that's an incredible lesson, and I think in the conversations that were happening, something that we need to be thinking about in terms of where we are facing these challenges here at home and as solidarity activists and playing these different roles, as whether it's in legal defense or as in political ways or in advocacy ways, that this has to be part of it. So I just kind of wanted to try to bring some of that together.